When I think about the 600,000 Americans who visit South America each year, I picture sunburns and memories. But the people in this video aren't part of that. From a nurse who trusted a stranger to save her sister, to a man who ignored warnings and threw food into the water and ended in unforgiving ways. This is Timothy, and welcome to Last Memories. It was March 14, 2016 in Medellin, Colombia. The city pressed inward. Street vendors crowded the sidewalks, motorbikes threaded through traffic, and the overcast sky held the warmth against the pavement. Victoria Rost was 29. She worked as a traveling nurse, rotating between hospitals, never settling long. But what brought her to Medellin wasn't work. Her younger sister had a worsening chronic illness that standard treatments weren't improving. She'd spent months searching traveler forums and expat circles for unconventional options abroad. She wasn't reckless. She was desperate in the way only someone watching a sibling deteriorate can be. In Medellin, she kept hearing about a quiet, unofficial clinic. Not legal, but effective. No one had an address. No one had been inside. But the story persisted, and for someone running out of options, persistence felt like proof. A man approached her near a pharmacy district after overhearing her ask about treatments. He spoke with enough medical familiarity to sound credible and showed her photos of supposed past patients. He didn't push. He just answered calmly, and that restraint made him believable. She followed him to an unmarked residential building 15 minutes from the main road. No signage, no waiting area, no patients. She noticed it all but weighed it against the chance this place operated quietly for a reason and walked in. Inside was a single room. A worn metal table under a low-watt bulb. Unpackaged tools on a side counter. No monitors, no IV stands. It smelled of cleaning solution layered over something older. She asked about methods and success rates. He answered in generalities, just enough to keep her seated. And she stayed, because leaving meant going home empty-handed to a sister running out of time. When he offered her a drink, she hesitated a bit, but in the end, she accepted it anyway to help her relax before the consultation. Within minutes, her coordination dissolved. She didn't lose full consciousness, but the gap between recognizing danger and responding widened with every second. He moved her onto the table. Drag marks later found across the concrete were consistent with resistance. Her hands gripped the metal edge hard enough to bend it. But the drug had taken too much. What followed wasn't surgical. It was uncontrolled. He worked without positioning, without sterilization, without any clear anatomical target. Tools were swapped mid-action. Movements were inconsistent, probing, adjusting, stopping, then starting again. At some point, something went too deep, too forceful. Blood pooled internally almost immediately. Her skin went pale. She may have still been partially aware as hemorrhagic shock set in, her breathing turning shallow, her fingers loosening from the table one by one. Death came from uncontrolled internal bleeding, likely within 20 to 40 minutes. For the first 48 hours, no one noticed anything was wrong. Her phone went inactive. Messages stopped mid-conversation. For days after, no one knew. No local contacts, no one waiting at a hostel. Back home, her family assumed she was between stops. They sent messages that stayed unread, called numbers that rang without answer. It took over a week before the silence felt wrong enough to file a report. Her body was found weeks later in an overgrown lot on the city outskirts, concealed beneath construction debris. Identification came through dental records. The cause of death was hemorrhagic shock from uncontrolled internal hemorrhage. Toxicology confirmed a sedative not self-administered. Post-mortem examination showed irregular abdominal incisions and superficial tissue disruption, consistent with a crude, non-medical attempt to simulate or search for something of value rather than a viable surgical extraction. No organs were recovered for transplant, and the damage indicated a lack of anatomical precision. Authorities entered the unit after odor complaints and found blood-stained flooring, improvised tools, and signs of repeated use. Investigators later connected at least 3 other missing foreign nationals who were last seen in the same district, though none were conclusively tied to the location. Vendors reported the same man approaching tourists for weeks. The case was treated as a predatory medical scam with fatal outcomes rather than a coordinated trafficking operation. The suspect was never identified. Victoria's case taught me that the people who destroy you sometimes look like the one person willing to help. But the next story unsettled me differently because this time nobody had to trick him. He saw the warning, heard it out loud, and chose to keep walking. It was October 22, 2017 in Los Nevados National Natural Park, Colombia. The trail started above 13,000 feet. The air was thin, cloud cover had been thickening since morning, and weather warnings were already out. Upstream rainfall was confirmed. Guides along the route knew what that meant for the canyon passages below. Sheldon Brisk was 34. He'd been making travel content online for nearly 3 years. Solo footage from locations dangerous enough to stop someone mid-scroll. But the channel had stalled, growth had flatlined, and sponsorship interest was drying up. The trip to Los Nevados was supposed to change that. High-altitude terrain most creators wouldn't touch. He needed something different. He traveled alone most of the time. No crew, no fixed schedule, no one tracking his movements. Going quiet for days was normal. Nobody would think twice. He'd joined a guided group that morning but was frustrated from the start. Guides had adjusted the route because of the weather, choosing a wider ridge trail that avoided the lower canyons. To Sheldon, that meant forgettable footage. At a fork, guides directed everyone right. Sheldon looked left toward the narrower canyon and made his decision. The last anyone saw of him was his back disappearing into the entrance. A few hikers called after him. He kept moving. The canyon walls rose 30 to 40 feet on either side and narrowed as he went deeper. The floor was slick with moisture and algae. Ankle-deep water was already running through the base, soaking through his boots. Further in, the passage tightened to where he could nearly touch both walls. The water had risen slightly. The sound changed, a low rumble from upstream, bouncing off the walls. He paused briefly, then kept going. The canyon was getting more dramatic with every step. The walls narrowed again, light dimmed. Water reached mid-shin, pushing rocks and sediment past his feet. The algae on the walls carried a water line well above his head, a stain from previous floods, showing how high it could fill. Sheldon was filming. He would have seen it. The canyon wasn't hiding anything. The water, the sound, the flood line above his head. But I think Sheldon had stopped weighing risk by that point. He was thinking about the shot that would finally move the numbers. The change didn't come all at once. The flow thickened first, pressing harder against his legs. It crept from mid-shin toward his knees, each surge stronger. The rumble built into a steady roar. By the time he reacted, it was too late. Upstream rainfall funneled into the drainage. The rise accelerated, climbing to waist level in a short burst, carrying debris, branches, rocks, sediment through the tight walls. He tried to climb. Algae and streaming water made the rock useless. He slipped almost instantly. The current caught his legs and ripped him sideways. He struck stone as the water drove him through the tightest sections. He was carried into a bend where the water formed a churning pocket that kept pulling everything back instead of letting it pass. Debris and roots had collected there. He was pinned. The water forced him under, gave him a fraction of a second at the surface, then pulled him back, each cycle shorter. Between impacts and the inability to hold a breath, his body gave out. Hikers on the ridge reported hearing a roar minutes after he left. By the time the trek ended, Sheldon wasn't there. That wasn't unusual. Some hikers take alternate paths and rejoin later. The guides assumed he'd exited on his own. It wasn't until the next day, when he failed to return his rented gear and hadn't checked in, that concern built. The canyon was still impassable. Search teams couldn't enter for 3 days. They found him wedged in debris at the bend, bloated from water exposure. Injuries matched high-energy collisions with rock in confined, moving water. His camera was recovered nearby, destroyed. Cause of death was drowning, compounded by blunt force trauma. The route was a known flash flood channel, and the waterline marks had been flagged in prior safety assessments. I sat with Sheldon's story longer than expected, because every part of it was avoidable. But what came next left me uneasy for a different reason. A man waist deep in a river, throwing food into the water, and getting a reaction he couldn't take back. It was January 27, 2015, in the Atacama Desert, Chile. Nothing out here looked like anything. The terrain stretched flat in every direction, dry, pale, and completely featureless. Daytime temperatures pushed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. No trails, no markers, no way to tell 1 mile from the next. Just sand and rock under a sky that offered zero shade. Doran Glee was 33. Back home, he worked a desk job he never talked about. The kind of work that paid the bills but gave him nothing to look forward to on Monday. Travel was the counterweight. He'd built his whole sense of identity around going places most people skipped over. Not resorts, not guided tours, but unmarked, empty, hard-to-reach locations where he could feel like he was doing something that mattered. Chile was the latest trip in that pattern, and the Atacama was the reason he came. He wanted to stand in the most desolate landscape he could get to. What Doran didn't know, or didn't look into, was that there had been quiet reports in the region for years. Solo travelers taking rides off-route, valuables gone, people turning up days later with no clear memory of where they'd been dropped, or not turning up at all. He'd been poking around the edges of the desert for a few days when a man offered him a ride to spots that weren't on any tourist route, locations only locals knew about. For Doran, that was the entire appeal. He got in without exchanging names or confirming where they were headed. He watched the last visible road sign pass by and didn't ask when they'd be back. Nobody knew he'd gotten into that vehicle. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone at his hostel or left a note with his plans. The drive stretched on, no phone signal. Nothing on the horizon to gauge distance or direction. The ground all looked the same. The driver chose every turn, and Doran had no way to retrace any of it. With every mile, he was getting further from anywhere someone might come looking. Then the vehicle stopped. Everything from this point forward was reconstructed from physical evidence recovered months later. The driver forced Doran out. His hands were bound. He was walked to a patch of ground where the sand was mixed with small rocks, compact enough to dig into and hold its shape. A shallow pit had been prepared. Doran was put inside. Sand and rock were piled over his legs first, then packed across his torso. The weight compressed his chest. His ribs couldn't expand fully. Breathing became shallow and inefficient almost immediately. With his arms pinned and his lower body locked under packed earth, he had nothing to push against. When he opened his mouth to gasp or shout, loose sand filled his airway. The heat compounded everything. At those temperatures, dehydration hits fast. Muscles cramp. Focus deteriorates. His chest was fighting against material that wasn't going to shift, and his body was burning through its reserves with no way to replace them. The official assessment concluded death resulted from positional asphyxia combined with airway obstruction, with extreme heat accelerating collapse. Nobody came looking for over a week. Doran didn't keep a schedule when he traveled. He checked in with family sporadically, and gaps in contact were normal. No one in Chile knew where he was or expected him at a specific location. By the time his family filed a report, there was nothing for authorities to work with. No last known position, no vehicle description, no witnesses. The wind had already resurfaced the ground. Any tire tracks or disturbance from that day were gone long before anyone started searching. Months later, erosion uncovered part of the burial site. Skeletal remains and scattered personal effects confirmed it was Doran. There was almost nothing left for forensic teams to work with. Authorities connected a suspect through a pattern of disappearances involving solo travelers and roadside robberies in the region, but the case stayed circumstantial. Too much time had passed. The desert had taken care of the rest. I couldn't find a single moment where Doran made an obviously wrong choice. That's what made his case so hard to process. Everything felt reasonable until it wasn't. The next one I researched, though, haunted me in a way I wasn't prepared for. A woman who fell from the sky into a forest canopy and hung there undiscovered while search teams walked the ground directly beneath her. It was May 18, 2018, on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The launch site sat on a hillside clearing overlooking dense Atlantic forest. By midday, crosswinds were picking up from the east in uneven intervals. Operators had already grounded 2 flights. The gusts were coming harder and less predictable with each passing hour. Felicity Clun was 26. She worked in marketing back home but had built a travel page online that was growing. She posted footage of cliff jumps, open water swims, a bungee where the cord grazed the river. No training in any of it. The numbers climbed every time she posted something that looked like it could have gone wrong. 2 brands had reached out about sponsorship, contingent on consistent engagement. The content wasn't a hobby anymore. She needed Rio to deliver. She was traveling solo. The only person who knew she was flying that day was the operator. What stood out when I looked into her final hour was how many small decisions stacked up before she ever left the ground. She arrived with a chest-mounted camera rig and secondary mount for aerial footage. After the harness fitting, she adjusted the straps herself, loosened the chest strap for the camera, shifted the leg straps for the secondary mount. The instructor told her it would affect control. She acknowledged it, but changed nothing back. Then the wind picked up. The operator paused launches. 2 other flyers stepped back. Felicity stayed. She'd posted that morning that paragliding footage was coming today. Rescheduling meant a content gap and 2 brand contacts who might move on. When the wind dropped briefly, she told the operator she was ready. Felicity didn't think she was gambling. That's what got to me. The cliff jumps, the swims, the bungee. To her, those weren't close calls. They were proof of concept. She'd built a system where danger was the product and survival was the expected return. Rio wasn't a risk. It was inventory. She launched into a lull. Within seconds, a crosswind hit from the right. Her modified straps had shifted her center of gravity, making the glider harder to read and slower to respond. The canopy responded late, then overcorrected. The right side of the wing folded. She held altitude for a moment, the glider buckling and partially recovering before the fold deepened. Roughly 150 feet up, too low for a reserve chute. The glider pulled hard left toward the tree line. She struck the upper canopy of a tall tree at speed. Branches cracked and redirected her downward until the line snagged in thicker limbs roughly 40 feet above the forest floor. The canopy draped over the branches above, settling into the surrounding foliage. Ground crew saw her veer off course but lost visual past the trees. Radio calls went unanswered. They searched the landing zones. Nothing. That night, her hostel bed went unslept in. Her phone was dead or destroyed. The paragliding post she'd promised never arrived. The operator called that first evening and got no answer, but solo flyers sometimes wandered after a flight. He told himself she'd turn up. It wasn't until the hostel flagged her room a second night that the unanswered calls started to feel like something else. He filed a missing persons report. 2 full days where Felicity was already gone and the world hadn't noticed yet. Search teams combed landing zones, clearings, trails, riverbanks, and walked directly beneath the tree where she hung 40 feet above them. The draped fabric had blended into the canopy, too dense from below, invisible from the air. Each week, the search pushed further from the launch site. Weeks later, hikers noticed straps and discolored fabric in the upper branches. Recovery teams found her remains still attached to tangled lines, 40 feet up, inside the original search perimeter. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the spine and thoracic region. The modified harness compromised her ability to respond to the collapse, and the marginal wind conditions pushed an already difficult situation past the point of recovery. What lingers about Felicity is where they found her. 40 feet above the people who spent weeks searching, inside a perimeter they'd already cleared on foot. The next story took me somewhere I wasn't ready for. No reckless choice, no ignored warning. Just a man who put his life in the right hands and the sky that brought them all down. It was September 3rd, 2016, in the Andes Mountains, South America. Base camp sat above 14,000 feet. Cloud ceilings had been sinking since dawn. Visibility was under a mile and dropping, and wind was building across the exposed ridgelines. Tanis Vran was 38. He ran a small warehouse operation back home. Long shifts, thin margins. He'd wanted to do a high-altitude trek since his 20s, but could never make the time or money work. His father had done a similar route decades ago and talked about it until the day he died. For Tanis, this wasn't a vacation. It was something he'd promised himself he'd finish, partly for the experience, partly to feel connected to a man he'd lost 3 years earlier. He'd saved for over 2 years and built the trip around a 2-week window between shifts. That window also meant he couldn't take the slow approach to altitude. Acclimatization needs gradual ascent, a few hundred feet per day, rest days built in. Tanis didn't have that margin. His itinerary pushed him above 14,000 feet faster than his body could adjust. The return flight was booked, the time off was fixed, and slowing down meant not reaching the summit his father had stood on 30 years ago. By the second day at altitude, his body was pushing back, headaches that wouldn't fade. His balance was going, stumbling on flat ground. The guides told him to rest. He did, briefly, then rejoined the trail next morning. Every hour resting was an hour further from the summit and closer to a flight home with nothing to show for it. By the afternoon of September 3rd, he couldn't walk straight. Breathing was labored, just standing still. When the guides spoke to him, his answers came slow and didn't quite track. The concern was that ordinary altitude sickness was tipping into something that attacks the brain or the lungs, conditions that can kill within hours. The guides made the call. Lower elevation immediately. Walking him down was no longer safe. The trail back cut through exposed terrain, turning dangerous by the hour, and his condition was deteriorating faster than a full-day descent could address. A helicopter could reach lower elevation in minutes. The guides weighed flying against the near certainty of losing him on the mountain and requested evacuation. With the weather still partially open and the patient declining, it was the call that made sense. This is where Tanis's story separates from every case I've covered. He listened, he agreed, he didn't argue. The people around him made the call they believed would save his life, and he trusted them. That's what makes this one hard. Everything that followed happened inside a decision that was supposed to be the right one. The helicopter launched under visual flight rules. The pilot was experienced and the window was still open. For the first several minutes, the flight held, threading through corridors of broken cloud, tracking ridgelines for reference. Then turbulence arrived, persistent and wearing. The cloud cover thickened from below. Gaps between clear sections grew shorter. Then flat light set in. The overcast killed contrast between rock and air. Ridgelines blurred into gray. The pilot was still in control, but the visual references that made control meaningful were dissolving. The helicopter struck a rocky slope. No engine failure, no mechanical issue. Controlled flight into terrain. The crew flew into a surface they could no longer see. Everyone on board died on impact. Base camp knew the helicopter had launched. The landing zone reported no arrival. Radio contact had dropped shortly after takeoff. For 48 hours, the same weather that caused the crash sat over the range and didn't move. No search aircraft could fly. Ground teams couldn't reach the upper slopes. Between those two facts, launched and never arrived, was a gap no one could close for 2 full days. Tanis's family was expecting a call that evening. They contacted the trekking company and were told evacuation had been initiated, but arrival was unconfirmed. For 48 hours, they sat with that sentence. Not told he was dead, not told he was safe, just waiting on a phone that never rang. When weather cleared, ground teams reached the slope. Wreckage fragmented across rock. The report cited controlled flight into terrain, no mechanical failure. Operators reviewed launch protocols afterward. Tanis was among those recovered. The summit his father had reached 30 years earlier was less than 2 miles from where the helicopter went down. Now the next story pulled me into something uglier. A man knee-deep in water, hand-feeding a reaction he thought he could control. It was July 9th, 2015, along the Amazon River, Brazil. The water was low. Dry season had pulled the river back from its banks, exposing mudflats and compressing the current into narrower channels. Fish populations were concentrated. Species that normally spread across miles of floodplain were squeezed into tighter water, competing for less food. Everything beneath the surface was hungrier and less tolerant of disturbance. Bobby Pratt was 31. He'd been bouncing between bartending and delivery work for years, always one slow month from not making rent. He hated it openly. The odd jobs were supposed to be temporary, a bridge to wildlife content creation. He'd spent 2 years filming himself provoking animals on camera, cornering lizards, slapping water near caimans, crowding nesting birds until they lunged. His audience was small but engaged, and every reaction video outperformed the last. He'd built his identity around being the guy who didn't flinch. The Amazon was supposed to be his breakout, the content that would let him quit the jobs he despised. He'd spent his savings getting there. No backup plan. When I first looked into Bobby, I assumed recklessness, but he'd been rehearsing for this for 2 years. Every provocation that ended clean was a dress rehearsal for a bigger one. The Amazon wasn't impulse. It was the finale he'd been building toward. He joined a guided river tour that afternoon. Earlier in the day, he'd already been pushing, slapping the water from the boat, dangling his hand near a caiman until the guide pulled him back. Each time, nothing happened. By the time the group stopped at a shallow section downstream, Bobby was running on a full day of reinforced confidence. The guide explained conditions: low water, concentrated populations, aggressive feeding, stay in the designated area. Bobby listened, then drifted downstream away from supervision. He waded in, knee-deep first, threw bread, fish surfaced. He threw more. Further out, activity thickened. He pushed to waist-deep and threw a larger handful. The surface erupted. This was the shot. He kept filming. What disturbs me about Bobby is that he wasn't reacting to the situation. He was directing it. He chose the spot, set the bait, positioned the camera, and waded in like a man running a chute. Every variable was his. What he didn't own was what happened after the first drop of blood hit the current. That belonged to the river, and the river didn't follow his script. Guides shouted from the bank. He waved them off, threw more food. The school was red-bellied piranha, a species that under normal conditions feeds on smaller fish, but in compressed dry season water with depleted food sources and the constant sensory agitation of splashing in chum, shifts into a sustained high-frequency feeding state. The conditions Bobby had walked into weren't unusual for July on the Amazon. What was unusual was that he'd built himself into the center of them. First bites hit his calves, tearing lacerations through exposed skin. He lurched back, still upright, still filming, maybe still thinking he could step out of it. But the riverbed was soft mud, and his footing was already compromised, and the bites kept coming in waves, not all at once but relentless, each one pulling more blood into the current. In a concentrated piranha population during dry season, blood doesn't just attract, it escalates. More fish, higher frequency. He was still trying to move when his legs gave. He went face first into the water, came up once, gasping, clawing mud trying to reach the bank. Pain was overriding coordination. He inhaled water. Blood loss and shock were pulling his body toward shutdown. He went under again. On the bank, guides were shouting and moving, but wading into active piranha feeding, especially with blood already dispersed through the water, meant entering the same trigger environment. They used poles, then a rope, working from the edge. By the time they got to him, he was motionless. Remains were recovered downstream the next day. Tissue damage concentrated on lower limbs, localized feeding, not full consumption. Clothing shredded in bite patterns. Cause of death was drowning, with blood loss and shock as accelerating factors. Guides confirmed he'd been warned. Every witness confirmed he started the feeding behavior. The whole sequence, first food thrown to face down in the water, took somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes. His camera was never found. Bobby's story ended this series for me. Not because it was the worst, but the clearest. He walked into that river, set the stage, fed the thing that killed him by hand, and held a camera while it happened. 2 years of borrowed luck, and the Amazon collected on all of it in under 5 minutes.